Hi, welcome back, everyone. So, I got into a debate on Twitter with a tanky, a communist, and they talked about a lot of things that I've been mulling around in my head, and I just think that there's so much that people these days aren't even aware of. Like tankies, far right people, like it's weird. I'm gonna show this video clip real quick that is a screenshot I took of the couple Twitter conversations, because right now the left does want a call to action. Okay, so first of all, with the communist lady that I was talking to, I find very interesting. I find it interesting when I meet a communist that doesn't even know who Antonio Gramsci is. A very, very big name in communism. Came from Frankfurt School, is known as the godfather of communism. He's the one that came up with ideas on how to infiltrate the left and try to create a revolution to establish communism in whatever country. The question that I kept asking and regurgitating over and over again that seemed to not be answered at all is that in communism they advocate for a homogeneous culture, one culture. And the far right, to my understanding, advocates especially things like ethno-nationalism, advocate for a homogeneous culture, one race, like North Korea, China. I think even Russia follows this. The question is, what is the difference between homogeneous and homogeneous? One is, well, essentially has nothing to do with your ethnicity, and the other one has everything to do with your ethnicity. Both imply a very rigid, very stagnant culture. One culture, one race. A lot of the citations this communist lady gave to me were Pan-African revolutionaries. Very, very extremists. Very big extremists. So I don't think that that's clever. I don't think that that's cute. It's like you're not asking for... I've seen this philosophy come up many, many times in Asian philosophy, is that it's a lot of the times people who want equality, balance, humanitarianism, egalitarianism, peace, try to obtain these by means of oppression and suppression or supremacy. And ultimately, that's just why I can't dig and can't get into communism. Communists say over and over again that they're these big pro-humanitarian, egalitarian people. But even Karl Marx says that you need a dictator to make sure that the communist way of life is established, and then this dictator is supposed to dismantle the government. Well, they never do. They never dismantle it. And anarchist philosophers have questioned this for a long time. Pretty much since the get-go. Pretty much ever since Karl Marx came up with the Communist Manifesto. Anarchists have read that and said, Wait a minute. A dictator? I don't know about that. So, the problem I have with communism is that, and especially when you're talking about Pan-Africanism, I just, to me, it's like, just because it comes from a different ethnicity doesn't make it better. Totalitarianism, authoritarianism, dictatorships, demagoguery, dogmaticism towards statism or nationalism. And that's something that a lot of people don't know the difference of these days, is the difference between being a patriot and being a nationalist. Nationalist is dogmatic, it's tribal, it's collectivist. It means that you're going to follow your country, your state, whether it's right or wrong. You don't question it. It's your home, your people, your culture, all this stuff. It can do no wrong. Patriotism, which is what the founding fathers of the United States was more inclined towards, is not dogmaticism. It means that it's your responsibility, and they did say this, it's your responsibility to question your government, to question your state, to question your country. Because when they do something wrong, you don't want to stand by it. You want to say, no, we're better than that. We don't do genocides because we're better than that. And so if the country starts participating in it, they want the citizens to be able to be like, no, I criticize that. That's not acceptable. Question the authority, question the power, because authority is not always right. These all have to do with Western philosophies, which is, again, something that a lot of people these days don't really understand what that means. What is Western? And I would guarantee you this. I know this communist lady, she probably has no idea. She probably thinks Western philosophy, first world nations, probably means colonialism and capitalism, and that's not what Western philosophy is referring to, or Western civilization. Western civilization has to do with a very specific type of philosophy. Some of it has an inkling towards Eastern or Asian philosophy. The Asian philosophers, they came up with some really good ideas too. Some very humanitarian, egalitarian, freedom-loving philosophies. Absolutely. Western world, though, is very, very specifically dates back to the Greek and the Roman Empire and has to do with philosophies such as democracies, which there are different types of democracies, and republics. And along with that comes due process, justice, secularism, liberalism, freedom. Any country that follows those values, like those are the philosophical values that govern their government or their society, is a Western nation. Egalitarianism, humanitarianism, again, Western philosophy. The countries that don't follow that philosophy, they don't do the democracies, they don't do the republics, they're not always inclined towards egalitarianism, humanitarianism, justice, due process, secularism, which, this is another thing, secularism. There's forced secularism and liberal secularism, anti-authoritarian secularism, non-forced secularism. The freedom to secularism is Western. Forced secularism is not. So when we say Western nation or first world nation, what we're referring to is a set of philosophical principles that date very, very far back, very old. And when we say second world nation, well, those are the nations that follow other philosophical principles for their society and how their government is ran. This would include North Korea, China, and Russia. They are second world nations. When we say third world nation, what we're referring to are nations that said basically, in a nutshell, I don't have time for any of that. And a lot of those countries have collapsed governments, or you still have the last standing theocracy in the world, the realm of Islam. And they are holding on to that title of the last standing theocracy with violent fervor. But most of it is located in the Middle East. I don't think theocracies, or, well, I don't. So, this is one thing that I do agree with Julius Evola on, and I'm not wanting to give that man a lot of credit or credence, because I've read through his work, and he's just hard to take very seriously and as an academic philosopher. It's hard to do. You're talking about a man that believes in telepathy. You're talking about a man that assesses quantitative value to one's soul or qualia, spirit, based on ethnic background, and even delves into masculinity and femininity. He looked at Asian philosophy, whereas most philosophers during the age of reason, a lot of existential philosophers looked at Asian philosophy, saw it like the death of ego. And a lot of them did that. And so you can step back and put your own biases aside and look at things for what they are. Julius Evola read these philosophies, and instead of death of ego, he experienced an ego inflation. And, so his head just went up into the clouds, and that's where it remained. But one thing I do agree with him on, and apparently this happens when people become more radicalized. It's really hard for me to talk about this as self-proclaimed anarchist, but I mean, I grew up, I understand that anarchism is a long-term goal. It's something that if the government was if all institutions were dismantled today, the people here would start engaging in violence. You'd have rapes, you'd have murders, because people don't have that ability to let go of their petty pride, ego, selfishness, things that we tend to let govern us, very emotional things that we tend to let govern us, that aren't really rational or logical. And so it would take a tremendous amount of evolving on a scale of the entirety of humanity to obtain something like anarchism. So it's just not within our grasp. It just isn't. I would say the same is true about communism. I think the end goal of communism is to ultimately end up with a Star Trek society. Oh, that's very beautiful. It's a wonderful idea. But again, humanity, humankind, human beings have to evolve mentally, as in be more mature, be smarter, be more intelligent, be more logical, more rational, in order to obtain such a society. And we just don't have that. It's a long-term, I would say both are long-term goals. But if I were to choose between communism and fascism, my response to that is, well, as an anarchist, someone who thinks we don't need government to, like, any kind of ruling body to tell us what to do. And I arrived at that through nihilism, not Marxism. But as an anarchist, I would have to say, I would prefer to live in a democracy or a republic any day over communism. Because at least in a democracy or a republic, freedom is valued. Communism, they haven't shown that they value freedom anywhere. You look at this Pan-Africanism stuff and it's like, well, this sounds like a very familiar perspective, but from a different ethnicity. And it makes it very hard to talk about and hard to make people understand the hypocrisy behind that. The hypocrisy of calling out fascists and then turning around and saying that you want a homogeneous society, or homogeneous society, one culture. This is very weird. The very word Pan-African breaks down into everything African. Well, that's supremacy. And I can't get behind that as an anarchist. I just can't stand behind anything with the word supremacy in it. I can't. I don't care what it is. So it doesn't make it more cute just because it comes from a different ethnicity, other than, white Nazis or neo-Nazis. It doesn't make it cute because you're a different ethnicity. And I see a lot of that rhetoric that comes from tankies, and it's really weird. So one of the problems that we get into, though, when I was having this debate is, the definition of liberal. And this is where I agree with Julius Evola, is that when the left and the right become radical and extreme, it tends to turn into anti-capitalism Marxism versus pro-capitalism fascism. That is not the political compass. That is not the axioms. There's a lot of different forms of government that are completely ignored if you look at it that way. You could have a monarchy without capitalism. That's still a dictatorship. Let's say that their unit of commodity instead of capitalism was women. Before you think that's a far stretch, this was a problem with the fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints. Fundamentalist Mormons, these people who were married to like 40, they had 40 wives, and they were marrying off 14-year-old girls to like 80-year-old men and impregnating them. This is really weird. So, talking to the women that have been freed from this, they will tell you that women were the commodity in that situation. The more women you had, the more social status you had within that group. And the person who was able to determine who was going to marry which girl ultimately had the supreme power in that situation. There was no capitalism involved. That's extremely oppressive and degrading. And capitalism is not the sole source of corruption and degradation that these communists say that it is. Capitalism has different formats. Well, there's different types of capitalism. I actually looked that up. Let me do it again. So you have oligarch capitalism, state-guided capitalism, corporate capitalism, entrepreneurial capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, and welfare capitalism. There's a lot of different types of ways that capitalism can be used, and in fact, I even looked at a chart that showed how communism and fascism both use capitalism and socialism, and they use those things in different ways. So, no. Capitalism itself does not automatically lead to degradation or the suppression of humanitarianism and egalitarianism or freedom itself. Corrupt capitalism does. Oligarchical capitalism is one of those. It's a form of crony capitalism. It's corruption, greed. Capitalism ruled by greed causes that. Capitalism, though, is not on the four-quadrant political compass because, well, lo and behold, capitalism is not a system of government. It's a system of economy or of commodity and commerce. And its etymology and origins come from the word cattle. It goes back to the barter and trade days. Cattle was seen as very high use of the ability to exchange goods and services. Cattle was very, very prized, very important. And that was used, you would use cattle to barter and trade for houses, goods, services, whatever. But that's where the word capital comes from. It's literally translating to cattle heads. So it goes all the way back to barter and trade. Barter and trade is essentially the beginning of capitalism. It's not a system of government. It's how us human beings have figured out how to exchange goods, services, monetary, to establish a monetary value that makes sense because, we did run into problems like a house builder would make a house for somebody who made bread. And it's like, well, you're not going to trade a loaf of bread for a house. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't add up. So that's where, money starts coming in. Or cattle. We used to trade cattle. But that's where the word capitalism comes from. The word liberal. She said liberals are about capitalism, period. And they're not on the left. Well, so let's explain the four-quadrant axioms of the political compass. The one that goes across the left represents collectivism. The right represents individualism. The top is authoritarianism. The bottom, liberalism. Liberalism, liberal, literally its origins, it means anti-authoritarian, to be free. That's what it means, freedom. What it literally translates to. There is a liberal left, an authoritarian left, a liberal right, and an authoritarian right. So that's why on a political compass, depending on if you take a legitimate political compass, you could score all over the place depending on what the issue is. Because it looks at it through the straight lens of that. Is it collective authoritarianism, collective anti-authoritarianism, individual authoritarianism, or individual liberalism? The most liberal position on the left you can possibly take is anarchism. The most liberal position on the right you could possibly take is tribalism. I'm a fan of anarchism, but I realize at my ripe old age that ain't gonna happen. I have to work within the system that's provided to me, but like I said, anarchism is a long-term goal. But ultimately, we live in a society of Western philosophy that tries to strive and change and adapt towards ever more freedom within reason. Obviously. That's the core principle of it, is freedom. It seems to be something the alt-right doesn't understand. They say, oh, we want to return our country back to where it was. Well, the idea of this country is based on Western philosophy. That's liberal philosophy. The idea that the founding fathers had the idea that society would change. And like I said, the founding fathers also had the understanding that you don't want the majority to oppress the minority, because majority is not always right. You don't want the minority to oppress the majority, because the minority is not always right. You have to try and obtain, and this comes from like Eastern or Asian philosophy, some kind of harmonious balance. It can be very difficult to do. Well, republic, we live in a constitutional republic. Part of a republic is to make sure that the minority is not squashed by the majority. And the part of the republic that is democratic tries not to let the majority overpower, or the minority overpower the majority. Did I say that right? You know what I mean. You know what I'm trying to say. So, again, this communist doesn't understand that. Like, oh, liberals are all about capitalism. And, from her very, very narrow view, capitalism is the right and anti-capitalism is the left. Well, no. These leftists, they say things like, they attack pain medication. I see that in Don't Punish Pain, my activism with that group a lot, is a company should not be able to profit off of addiction. Well, what do you think the drug lords are doing? That's exactly what they're doing. I've been around, not drug lords specifically, but I've been around gang type members, of people who deal with mafia or like MS-13 and gangs like that. And they would do they didn't used to, they still do this. They have a thing where they call creating an addict. And that can be quite violent, and usually the targeted person is isolated from their friends and family and becomes heavily abused, becomes pretty much a sex object. A lot of problems in that, and it's very, very bad. But the reason why fentanyl is ending up in your heroin and your crack and your cocaine is because the drug lords want to make it more addictive, so you continue to come back. They are thus profiting off of addiction. And if you think about it, to those who say anarcho-capitalism doesn't exist or can't exist, well, the drug lords are a real living example of anarcho-capitalism. It's capitalism with absolutely no regulations on it whatsoever. They can do whatever they want. And you just have to put faith in whoever you're buying your stuff from, that they're being honest with you if they put that in there, or that they're very adamant about not putting it in there. It's very difficult to do that. But see, like when it comes from a pharmaceutical company, we have this thing called the FDA, and they're beholden to very, very strict regulations that make it so that the drug is safe for human consumption, albeit addictive. And that's one of the big differences is, purity, dose, all that. So I think that's extra interesting. It's like when it's there's a company profitizing off it. Well, I agree with the sentiment that somebody probably shouldn't profit off of addiction. They're going to. They do with cigarettes, they do with alcohol. I mean, but I'd rather it be controlled and regulated than left up to an anarcho-capitalist system where you can put whatever you want in it and make it even more addictive. And with cigarettes, now they're, required to say, we put extra added stuff in this to make it more addictive. They have to be honest. They've been forced to. And I think that's good. I think that they should be honest. I think that there should be a standard of regulations on the drugs we consume to make sure that they're safe. Absolutely. But the example of liberal that this communist brought up was very specific, a very specific type of title of liberal, which was classical liberal. And it's like, well, yeah, classical liberals do promote a lot of capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism to be exact. I'm not entirely a fan of laissez-faire capitalism. I'm a fan of mixed economy. I think you can have free market capitalism, but I also think you need some rules and regulations in place for accountability and liability, which is pretty much what the United States has, a mixed economy of socialism and capitalism. More emphasis on capitalism. But you could call it welfare capitalism as well. But I find it annoying that they do this. So alt-right people know Western philosophy is about freedom. It is about secularism, due process, justice, all those things. And fascism is not part of that. It's second world country stuff. Sorry, but I'm not sorry. It's facts. This stuff matters. This stuff happened. We have these definitions. If every word that comes out of my mouth is arbitrary, then we're going to have a big problem communicating if we don't understand each other. It completely negates communication altogether. So classical liberalism is usually sort of a center-right liberalism. So you're a little bit, you're on the center, you're on the below the authoritarian axis, but just a little bit, and just over to the right a hair. And then also what was brought up was neoliberalism, which is the commodification of the left. It's, how do I explain it? It's basically sort of like take left and turn it centrist. So most of today's Democrats fall in the category of neoliberal. So that's what those mean. But it doesn't mean that capitalism itself is inherently about, I'm looking for a particular word and it's not coming to me. But capitalism itself is not inherently that. It's not inherently oppressive, suppressive. Can't think of the word at the moment. So with the whole call to action stuff now, I keep wondering about that. When has it gone far enough for it to no longer be too far? And that's the question. How far is too far? What is that? When is it that you can start acting violently to defend civil rights, liberties, freedoms? When does that become acceptable? Where's the line in the sand when that becomes before, like when it's unacceptable and then, oh, they crossed the line, now it's acceptable? When does that happen? How far can this chiseling away of rights, liberties, and freedoms goes before calls to violence are no longer inappropriate, but very appropriate? When? When does that happen? So, overturning Roe v. Wade is not the only thing that has happened. I don't know if you know this, but they attacked, the Supreme Court also attacked the Fourth Amendment. And they made it so that if a police officer does something not legal to you, you can no longer sue them and take them to court. And the Supreme Court has also urged all courts that are overseeing any case that has to do with this particular subject to throw them out immediately. And I find that interesting because the Republican Party is supposed to be anti-federalists. That's pretty big government, isn't it? When the Supreme Court is telling all the other courts and all the other states, throw out these cases because they're, cases of a civilian suing a police officer for, I don't know, let's say, battery. Now, what is his name? Clarence Thomas is talking about attacking Obergefell v. Hodges and Lawrence v. Texas. The Obergefell v. Hodges doesn't bother me as much. But the Lawrence v. Texas, that is very, very scary. There's a few states out there that don't have anti-sodomy laws. They took them off the books before Lawrence v. Texas happened. Many, many states still have them. They're not enforced. They haven't been taken off the books, but they've been made irrelevant because of Supreme Court hearings like Lawrence v. Texas. If they overturn Lawrence v. Texas, they will make every homosexual that lives in a state that still has anti-sodomy laws on the books criminals overnight. Literally criminals overnight. I don't know how, in what way you can consider that freedom. Even if you're not a homosexual and you don't like us, the ability to suppress and oppress us LGBT people is not your freedom. That's you asking for the freedom to suppress and oppress another group of people just because you don't like them. That's not freedom. There's no victim involved here. As long as it's between two consenting adults, and another thing is there's a difference between informed consent and uninformed consent. You can consent to something that you don't know what you're consenting to, which is why coercion laws exist, anti-coercion. If they put a document in front of you, if your employer puts a document in front of you, they're writing you up, and they have something on there that you didn't do, you have the right not to sign it. If they lock you in the room and say you can't leave until you sign that, that's coercion, you can have them arrested. It is illegal. So, yeah, trying to get somebody to sign something without even telling them what it is, that's coercion. That is uninformed consent. So, as long as it's informed consent between two adults, there's no victim. No victim. The parties are happy. Nothing bad's happening. It's not the end of the world. It's okay. It'll be all right. There's no reason for criminality here. None. There is no argument you can possibly give me to say that suppressing LGBT rights, violating them, is freedom by any shape of the word or the meaning. It's not. It's not. There's no reason to do this. None. Other than bias and bigotry, schism and hatred. Learned behaviors, people who have taught you to feel this way. So, how is that freedom? I don't think it is. And I still would say that if they overturn Overfell v. Hodges, yeah, that's not freedom either. The problem is I don't really care if I've said this time and time again. It's secularism, okay? The thing is that the states started looking at marriages as a sort of that there's an issue there. You have things like power of attorney, or how your assets get redistributed. Let's say you want to be cremated, but the place that you're at wants to bury you. Well, if the state doesn't recognize your domestic partner, and they say, well, no, he wanted to be cremated, not buried. Sorry. Family members that have nothing to do with the person who's passing away because they're homophobic. They've never liked their child. They disown them and all that kind of crap. Because they're family, though, and that person dies, they can come in and seize all their assets, leaving their partner with nothing. These are real problems with the state not acknowledging that two people of the same sex are coupled in a relationship together, for the long haul, just like heterosexual people do. So none of that is freedom. None of that's freedom. And I think everyone has a right to be really pissed how the Supreme Court justices are talking. I hope they don't overturn Lawrence v. Texas. I hope they don't overturn Overfell v. Hodges. I hope not. They're already talking about regulating or stopping contraceptive and prophylactics. Again, not freedom. And very big government, too. Not something I would expect the Republican Party to be. I've been meaning to email my grandpa about this. What's happening to your Republican Party? It's not so Republican. It's so federalist. Got a lot of Nazis, like little fascists and Christo-fascists and theocrats and plutocrats running around in your party. What's going on with that? What the Supreme Court is doing is not very Republican. It's conservative, I'll give you that, but it's not Republican. Nope. No, sir, it is not. So, the call to action. Personally, I view that most civil rights have been won with both a combination of pacifism and violent. You need the pacifists and the aggressors to make a civil rights action work. The pacifists are there for the optics. They are the diplomats. They put the face behind the movement of, like, we can be civil. We can be diplomatic. We're going to debate. We're going to discuss. We're going to talk to the naysayers. We're going to make the arguments. The aggressors are the show of force. And I think both are necessary, unfortunately. But I just don't know when you say, okay, enough is enough, now we have to. I don't know when that happens. I really don't know. I would personally, I find it ironic that anyone would suggest that they want to they're on the road to maximizing freedoms, egalitarianism, and humanitarianism on the road of violence. That's really bad optics. Violence for peace doesn't make sense. Like I said before, I've arrived at anarchism through nihilism, not Marxism. And it's summed up in that Mephisto Walls song, Kings, that I've quoted several times. The things that claw and the things that gore are unreliable things. And so is a man with a sword in his hand, and snakes and rivers and kings. They say women in there too. And women and rivers and kings, that's what it is, yeah. They're all unreliable. It's all the same thing. People competing for power and control. I would rather live in a democracy, or I'm a big fan of feral democracies. Love feral democracies. Love that. What wouldn't happen today? Wouldn't. But I again, with this little communist girl, like, where does social democracy play then? Where does democratic socialism play? What is a monarchy? What is a theocracy? What is tribalism? What is a republic? Where do these things fall on the political compass? If the political compass is anti-capitalism and pro-capitalism, and that's it. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, yeah, we have this call to action. We do. I think being very, very loud and protesting is very, very important right now. And I think to the people who are supporting the Republican Party that are not part of this regime of neo-fascism and white supremacy and all that, the Christo-fascist stuff, if you're not in favor of that. All of this might sound really good until you follow it to its end goal. And I think a lot of people who vote Republican are going to will end up regret if this happens. If this happens, I do not possess magical powers. I cannot predict the future. But if we follow the alt-right to their final conclusion, and I'm not saying necessarily that they'll be putting LGBT people to death. They don't have to do that to be oppressive. But if they start putting LGBT people in prison and locking them up, I think many people who have supported this and on a sort of surface level will start seeing that in person, start having family members and stuff that they know and care about locked up. I think they're going to look back in it and regret and go, oops. And by then it'll be too late. So, yeah, we don't need to be locking up LGBT people. We don't need to be doing that. And then there's the extreme measure, of course, where they're being pulled out of the house and having hoods put over their heads and being shot. That definitely would get a lot of people to go, oh my God, what have I done? And that's what I mean. When do you know it's gone too far? When do you know that? When can you say that with certainty? And the thing about the Fourth Amendment, so let's say you're an LGBT person right now and you're in a southern state. Very small, very small police departments. Teensy-weensy. This goes back to the old days. This is what happened in the old days to LGBT people. They'd wander around the South, small town, get harassed by a police officer, been subjected to police brutality just because the police officer doesn't like LGBT people. Now you can't do anything about it. Or the police officer might look the other way in the small town while one of their town members does it. That doesn't automatically mean death, but you will have cases like Matthew Shepard again because of what they've done to the Fourth Amendment. How is that freedom? How in what I have thought about this and I've tried to wrap my head as hard as I could around this concept. How can you rationalize that as freedom? As liberalism? How? How can you do it? I can't come up with a single answer. There is no way of sorting out the different points and coming to the conclusion that is freedom. By any shape of definition of it. None. Can't be done. It's not. It's not freedom. We have literally had freedoms just taken away from us in a very big way. We're not talking about banning Kinder eggs or lawn darts here. We're talking about making criminals. We're not talking about a slap on the wrist. We're talking about criminality. And if they overturn something like Lawrence v. Texas or Oberfeld v. Hodges, you've made people into criminals just on the sole premise that they exist. Just that they exist. Pay no attention to Chickmakin. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We all understand sexual attraction is involuntary. I don't know how you could not know that. I think you'd have to be pretty fucking brain dead not to know that. It's pretty self-explanatory. You don't need a science guy in a lab coat to explain that to you, I would think. Pretty self-evident. So, that's where we're at in this country. And that's what I find funny, is that, like, anyone who has ever wanted me to vote Republican, it's like, why on earth would I vote for that party? They do not like me for many reasons. And I just don't think I don't ever see the Republicans overturning prohibitions. I don't see it. The only people who talk about that are leftists. They're the only people who talk about it. Very fringe group on the left that talk about overturning prohibitions. And libertarians. These are the only people that talk about that. There's still a ton of people on the left that don't even talk about that. A ton. But I have never, ever heard a Republican say that. Ever. Ever. Never. Ever. And it probably ought to, That's actually something the old school Republican Party, the great old party, GOP, would have been in favor of, is getting rid of the federal hold on marijuana. Because the original philosophy of the Republican Party was to deconsolidate. They wanted to break up groups that were gaining high amounts of power and authority and control. Decentralizing, break up the power, that no one thing should have too much authority and power. That's bad, including the federal government, which the federal government holding on to that marijuana clause is what's keeping the rest of the states from doing what they want to do. So old school Republicans probably would have had that happen. But right now, the only word you hear about it comes from the left. The left desperately wants the feds to let go of marijuana. Let it go. And they won't. What's happened to the Republican Party? What's happened to it? It's a shadow of what it used to be. I would say the same for the left, but the Democrats, they're pretty moderate. They're not anarchists and communists, and most of them are not woke scolds. When you hear them platform and talk, they don't talk about woke scoldy stuff, SJW stuff. They don't. The closest you're going to get is like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Most of them don't bring that stuff up, though. The problem is that when the Democrats propose something that FDR would have proposed to help with the economic problem that we have right now, the Republican Party loves to stand up and call it communism, socialism, big government, conflate two of them, conflate all three. And they filibuster it, they block it, they do everything in their power to stop the Democrats from breaking up the crony capitalism, and then blame the crony capitalism on the Democrats, which is odd. So that's happening. And then you see the Supreme Court doing what they're doing. If we continue down this path, like if you take America's progress back to where we began, the United States, I hate to say it, we would no longer be considered a Western nation, because all other Western nations have evolved with humanitarianism and egalitarianism, that if we went back to the founding of this country, we would be a second world nation. Possibly worse. Who knows? No. The communist perspective is weird. I am not going to bow before anything. I don't even bow before the country I live in. Not because of Marxism, but because I find it pointless. It's just a thing we made up in our head. That's nihilism. Futility. That everything is nothing. It's all pointless. This is a bunch of crazy crap that we made up. And it is. So, I've rejected all dogmaticisms. Dogma. I've rejected it. It's just not something I'm interested in. I don't want to bow before anything. That's anarchism. Oh, and democracy, literally, this is something the communist lady didn't understand too, is democracy literally translates to power to the people. That's what democracy means. And a republic is a hybrid democracy because they realize that the majority is not always right. So that's where we're at, and I don't know how you can consider what the Supreme Court is proposing and what they've done to be liberty. I don't see that. And why is it that whenever leftists show up to protest, and I just mean protest with signs, little speaker talking points, we're violent? The big worry that a lot of leftists have, though, is that, like, the people who did the January 6th, well, they got pardoned and stuff. Well, it's weird. They broke into a government building. They did something pretty extreme. Off the hook. Okay, that's kind of weird. They called that a protest. When the left protests, then suddenly, oh, they're violent. And when the left gets backed into a corner and can't move and they riot, the people of the left, us leftists, we do not get the same courtesy from the government that right-wingers do when they lose their mind and think it's acceptable to go up to a Capitol building and break into it and threaten the lives of elected public officials and try to overthrow them. That should be criminal activity. That should absolutely be. They should be arrested for that. It's insane how many people were let off from that. It's insane. People died. When leftists riot, the idea is not to hurt people. The idea is to get people to pay attention. That's the idea. But then you do have the tankies. The tankies do seem kind of violent. I think most people understand there's a time and place for it, but that's the question is when do we decide it's time? When is it okay for us to say, okay, you've manhandled our civil rights, liberties, and freedoms enough, and we need to make a statement saying, like, stop. Like, stop now. Yeah, what is a leftist to do? You think that we should just lay down and like carpets and let everyone just walk all over us? No. I don't advocate for violence. I think it's pointless. I'm not joking about that. Violence is pointless. The only time I can ever rationalize violence is if it's in self-defense. But the direction things are going, something has to be done. And to leftists that love to kick people out of the left just because they disagree with one tiny little thing, you need to stop. Because we need allies. And there's a lot of people that are voting right-wing right now that otherwise wouldn't if communist weird people that want you to lick their communist boot instead of the fascist boot. I don't understand that, but bow before the emperor. You have them, and you have the woke scolds constantly pushing people out, going like, oh my god, you agreed with something from the right, like one thing, just one thing that you agree with on the right, and then, oh, you're not a leftist, or oh, you're a liberal, like that's an insult or something. And it's like, you don't even know what that word means, fuck you. As self-proclaimed anarchist, somebody who loves feral democracies, I'm a liberal, I'm a leftist. I'm a liberal leftist. Yeah, that's right. So where was I? I lost my train of thought. Fuck. So, yeah, I mean, that's ultimately the question I'm left with. Is what are we supposed to do at this point? Where do we go? Where are we heading? Why are we allowing this? Oh, yeah, that's what I was talking about. How the woke scolds and the very seems to be the tankies don't interact with a lot of tankies or communists, so not terribly familiar with talking to an individual who identifies as one too often. Like, I did in the early 2000s, but when I talked to a communist, we didn't fight. We agreed on a lot of stuff. We just disagreed on how to get there. But the communists today, they're pretty radical. And I would even say that radical anarchism is probably a bad thing too. Like you look at like the Unabomber or Timothy McVeigh that bombed the Oklahoma building. Both of them are radical anarchists. They are. Like what the Unabomber was doing was totally an anarchist. Like fuck the system, fuck society, fuck the infrastructure, fuck it all, fuck the capitalism. Just fuck everything. It's like, that's an example of like an anarchist that got so fucking angry and pissed off it wasn't about propaganda by deed. It was about propaganda through violence. As KMFDM said, radical anarchists, fascists, and terrorists are responsible for the violence. That's a good quote. I agree with it. But they should rewrite it to include radical communists and radical anarchists. But these radicals, they one tiny disagreement from a liberal, pretty much a centrist, and they push them into the right sphere, and now we have a bunch of people voting Republican that normally wouldn't. But I'm asking the Republicans now, why do you keep voting in these nut bars that think it's cool to piss on the entire concept and idea of civil rights, liberties, and freedoms? Why are you putting these people in office? In your local states. People that make campaign videos that just... I don't even know how to explain it. It's not something a rational person would do. These people do not seem rational. Like, even if I was a Republican, I would be looking at these ad campaigns and going, this person is not rational. This is not a sane person. Like one of them said that their hero was the Unabomber. Like, you want somebody who idolizes the Unabomber to be in public office. Why? That's kind of scary, extreme. You have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene that have said some of the most bizarre, off-the-wall, lunatic stuff. Just, she is nuts. I mean, really, like you think Nancy Pelosi is bad? Oh my God, no. Marjorie Taylor Greene is, she needs to take her Seroquel, her Abilify, something. She needs an antipsychotic. You got loads of them though in the right now, and I don't know why you did this, and I don't know how Mitch McConnell's getting away with what he's doing. I have no idea. There's no accountability, and that's one of my fears of deregulating, is that what ends up happening is there's no accountability or liability for those who do impinge on others. Yeah. So, what do you all think we should do? Answer my question here. How far is too far? Answer that. Do you think leftists should be penalized more harshly for trying to defend civil rights, liberties, and freedoms than the right? Now, keep in mind, you're talking to a leftist. I'm an anarchist. I am very, very much pro-free speech, so don't throw that shit my way. Okay? I'm not in charge of the YouTube platform user terms of agreement, nor Twitter's or Facebook's. Don't throw that sass at me. Okay? I think you should have the right to say you're bullshit, even though it's bullshit. I just wish less people would realize, I wish more people would realize it's bullshit. And a bunch of conspiracy theories. Really, I wish Michael Shermer would come back. I wish Michael Shermer and Antoinette and Sam Harris would take a final stand on this, because they really good at it. But they were kicked out because because Sam Harris, in his case, he's an Islamophobe. No, yeah, I don't think he is. I think he understands the difference between a fundamentalist and a radical jihadist. I think he knows the difference. I don't think he's Islamophobic. I think he's just an atheist that criticizes all religions. Richard Dawkins, I would bring him up, but he's too old to continue the fight. He got canceled because he's a biologist, and most of his understanding of sex and gender is pretty much biological in nature. But he's supported LGBT rights for a long time. Very, very weird to see him canceled. Michael Shermer, I have no idea what happened with him. He was pretty cool. No idea. But Michael Shermer is really good at debunking neo-Nazi shit. Really fucking good at it. He makes that his job. He's really good at it. I think more people need to do that. I think it's really hard, because anytime the left tries to speak out against Nazi propaganda and say, hey, that's propaganda, there's been so many people on the left to point at someone and call them a Nazi where they're not. And now it's at a boy cried wolf situation, which was a talking point amongst anti-SJWs, is that if they continued doing that, it would become a boy cried wolf situation. And keep calling these people Nazis that aren't Nazis, and you actually have a problem with Nazis, no one will believe you. Well, I think that's where we're at. It's where we're at, isn't it? Yeah. All right. Yeah, let me know in the comment section. Do you think leftists should just roll over, let people walk on them? Do you think protesting is enough? I don't think any leftist will ever do anything like January 6th. I don't think any leftist will ever do that. They will never do that. But do you think rioting is inappropriate? Nobody said when what happened with Rodney King in 1992, no one ever said that was inappropriate when people rioted over that. Just keep that in mind. Well, what do you think, though? And how far is too far? When does the violation of rights, civil rights, liberties, and freedoms get so bad to a point where it's crossed that line where it's now okay and understandable. I'm interested in these questions. So let me know what you think in the comment section. Alright. This video's gone on very, very long. Sorry about the time. Had a lot on my mind. Hopefully you like and share. And good to each other. Out.